Hey friends, welcome to episode 57 of the Reluctant Leader Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Jenkins, and today my guest is Christa Cordova. Now, Christa is a mental health educator and she's a fellow doctoral cohort member. That is a mouthful. Now, Christa helps people heal from spiritual trauma and church abuse. It's a recurring theme you're hearing in these interviews because a lot of my cohort members deal with this kind of trauma. So this conversation is raw, it's hopeful, and it's deeply practical, especially for pastors and leaders who want to make sure their churches are places of safety and not shame. So I'm super glad you're here. I think you're going to get a lot out of this conversation. So grab some coffee, take a deep breath, and then let's lean in. Because what you're going to hear today could help you or someone you love heal from church hurt. Hey, it's our honor to have Christa Cordova with us on this episode of the Reluctant Leader Podcast. Now, listen, she is in the doctoral cohort that I'm in, and so that's how I know her. And I'm like I said on the last episode, my goal is to eventually get to interview everybody that's in that cohort because everybody's amazing. Everybody's got something to say. But she's a mental health educator. She specifically helps people deal with spiritual hurt and trauma. And if you have ever been in church, then you know that you probably need to listen to this episode because all of us have some of that. So, Christa, I just want to give you the chance to introduce yourself and then just explain, talk to me like I'm 3 years old and explain what a mental health educator is and does. And then we'll just kind of tackle some questions and see where this conversation goes. Again, it's so good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. It's so great to be here with you and to have a chance to talk about this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. I, at different points in my life, have experienced church abuse and church trauma. And I'll get to those definitions in just a second, but that eventually led me through seminary, through several church-based positions, and also in several parachurch ministry positions. That contributed to, in some cases directly, in some cases indirectly, to my trauma history. So eventually that led me through my own healing journey and to a university campus where I worked as a mental health educator, providing mental health first aid and QPR suicide prevention training for the students, faculty, and staff in that setting. And that work, of course, drew me into considerations of my own experiences in the church. And I started applying the mental health principles I was learning in a secular setting to both my seminary training and then also my own experiences, which led me to start working with spiritual abuse survivors as well as I moved further into my healing journey. So what I do now is I work in a form of mental health support called critical incident stress management, and I provide early intervention mental health services for spiritual abuse or spiritual trauma survivors. So I work with them to educate them on what they might have experienced or provide some options and definitions about their experiences to provide validation, let them feel like they're connecting with someone who really sees and feels what they've experienced. And then I help them decide if they have existing resources or if they need to go somewhere else for a deeper level of care.
Wow. So, and what I'm thinking as you're talking is, I love that it's kind of also a little preventative, like you're helping people, I guess, recognize what I experienced. Is it actually abuse or trauma? And I try to say this lightly because I don't want to take those words lightly. I want to say it carefully. It feels like in our culture, everything's getting labeled with these big, giant, weighty words. And so it can't be either or, right? Like we can't go, well, none of it's legit or all of it's legit. And so I love that you're kind of in that messy middle, sounds like, helping people diagnose it and then help people heal from it, which is, awesome. I'm thankful that you're doing that.
Yeah, thanks. And you're right, it is messy. And we throw culturally words around like abuse and trauma, like they are nothing, which sometimes can render them meaningless. So if someone is experiencing something difficult that is painful at church, that might not be spiritual abuse. So what I do is help provide the scaffolding through some of that educational infrastructure is kind of like what I like to say. And one of those is providing definitions. So I use the American Psychological Association's definition of spiritual abuse, which is using beliefs or authority to manipulate, control, or hurt someone, usually through shame and fear. And that can be a single incident. Sometimes we read about those single incident spiritual abuse happenings in the headlines related to physical abuse, or it can be something that is chronic and systemic. So there are people that I have worked with in the past that have been financially manipulated by their churches, and I feel like that's something we don't talk about very often, but can contribute to the development of trauma symptoms. And trauma, by definition, is again not just something that is hard or uncomfortable. It is a situation that is so overwhelming, a person who's experiencing those abusive situations doesn't have the resources with which to cope. So, from a mental health education perspective, I'm trying to help people go through the discernment process to understand, have they been hurt by a church or have they been abused by a church? And have they experienced something difficult that they were able to cope with and manage well on their own? Or do they have they experienced trauma to the extent that they need to see a trained therapist to help them work through their trauma healing journey?
Right.
And, that kind of gets at like the consumer part of church, like sometimes like we think we're uncomfortable and we think we're being traumatized.
Yeah.
And that's not actually true. So I can kind of, in my conversations with my clients, I just work with them through that discernment process to really understand what their experience is, maybe in light of their current context.
Yeah. So do you see a larger percentage of people who are coming to you because they were maybe on staff or on the team at a church and experienced that, or people that were sitting as congregants and experienced that? And I'm asked that selfishly because as a pastor, I'm a leader of a church, and I think the more aware I become of abuse, the like I don't want to be frozen, but I also don't want to act like it's not a thing. And it's made me kind of like, you can get paralysis of analysis. Like, I'm never going to do anything as a leader because I don't want to cause any abuse, which I do think God is thankful that at least leaders are aware of it and asking that question. But how prevalent is it in I just attend church and this thing that got said during a sermon feels like abuse to me? Or is it more like you mentioned, financial manipulation? Hey, I told you if you meet these three criteria that we would hire you, we would pay you this, and now I'm not going to do that. Just does that question even make sense? You can tell I'm wrestling in real
Yeah, it does.
time as we're
Yeah,
talking.
absolutely. Yeah, and first of all, I just appreciate the fact that you are wrestling, because it shows that you do have that self-awareness and the curiosity to explore your function as a leader. And biblically, I think of leaders as shepherds, who are essentially functioning as the bell sheep for all of the people who are following behind them. So Jesus is the shepherd, but in every flock, there's a sheep that wears a bell, and the bell sheep knows the master's voice and essentially is like the sheep version of a mentor. So they're following the master, and then all the rest of the sheep hear the bell and they're following the bell sheep who's following the master.
Wow.
So when I think about pastoral leadership, like pastors are called to be the bell sheep. And if they're not wrestling with the implications of trauma and abuse for themselves as the bell sheep leader and their congregation, the rest of their sheep, then they have a problem. So self-awareness is really key. Answering your question about prevalence, most of my clients are coming to me after experiencing staff level church abuse. And I don't know that the research necessarily supports that the church staff are experiencing more abuse than the general population. I think it's probably just my position at this point in my career that I'm tending to attract those types of clients. And I think that that is happening because there aren't spaces for people to process what healthy, trauma sensitive leadership looks like. Very often, for the points that you raised earlier, there's the general awareness that it's going on, but there's not the willingness to engage in these conversations.
Yeah.
So they find their way usually to me after they've burned out of ministry, and they're trying to make sense of their situation and what they experienced and trying to decide if they still want to stay in it.
Mm.
But sometimes in the cases of their experiences, what they've experienced is actually secondhand trauma. So they will be at an associate level, they'll have a senior pastor who expects them to behave a certain way in their role. And so then they feel like they're either witnessing trauma being inflicted on a congregation, which will sometimes lead to a church split, for example,
Yeah.
or a mass exodus of a certain type of congregation sector. So like, for a while, a lot of millennial women were leaving churches. And why was that happening? It was because they were showing up in unsafe environments, and the structures that created that sense of lack of safety were being perpetuated and supported by the senior pastor.
Mm-hmm.
So associate pastor in the specific case that I'm thinking about didn't feel like he had a voice to express what he was witnessing on behalf of the millennial women in his congregation. So eventually he realized that the writing was on the wall and he had to leave.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a both and situation for me, but a lot of what I'm doing is I'm listening to those stories and helping that pastor make sense of their situation and discern what next steps are necessary. And in probably about 75% of the time in my case, I am meeting with someone very short term for a series of short term conversations and then referring them to a licensed therapist for deeper work.
Okay. Yeah, I think this conversation is worth it for me just to hear you talk about the bell shepherd. Is that the bell sheep, the bell shepherd? Is that what you call it?
Yeah.
I feel like I should have known that as a pastor, but I've never heard that before, and I love that. Right? Because like even on our organizational flow chart at the church, Jesus is the senior pastor.
I
Like,
love that. That's amazing.
and it's always just like he's the head of the church, he's the pastor. Like I'm one of the followers, I'm just one of the like a lead follower type of a thing. And I've never heard that expression. And yeah, maybe I'll put that as my title on the org chart.
I love that.
I love that.
Head bell sheep.
Yeah, head bell sheep. People are like, wait, what? What is that? Yeah, that's so good. So as you were talking, another one of the books that you mentioned that you wanted to recommend is a church. Is it Church Named Tav or called Tav? I can't remember now the title of it.
I think it's a church called Tav by
Yeah.
Scott
Do you
McKnight.
you want to mention anything about that? Because I keep thinking
Sure.
about it while you're talking. Like I read that book during the pandemic when everybody was losing their minds, and it was just like it was like drinking a cold cup of water on a hot day. It was so refreshing to my soul.
Yes, absolutely. And, one of the reasons why I love that book is because it kind of starts with um, when I think about church and healing, I think through the lens of a Japanese art form called Kintsugi.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kintsugi is all about the art of taking something from broken to beautiful. So, it's not always that, I would drop a vase, for example, and then have to glue it back myself. I might stumble upon a broken vase and notice it and pick it up and decide to apply repair so that the vase could be brought into a more beautiful functioning version of itself. Um, and the reason that I bring that up in relation to the book, Church Called Tav, is it's Tav or Tove. I never know. So I'll just go with Tav.
You
We'll just say
say
Tav.
you say one, I'll say the other, and then one of us will be right, and one of us
Perfect.
will be wrong, but it's fine.
That's okay. It's also broken and that can become beautiful. But one of the things that the book outlines is really just kind of like what I would envision like a noticing church would look like. So a do no harm church, borrowing terminology from the medical community.
Mm-hmm.
So it outlines both Some of the challenges of the church, kind of the way that we operate, and whether or not we can be for healing or preventative of healing. And it helps leaders understand how to become a safe environment. So
Yeah.
it's about how we recognize what's going on and don't contribute to additional brokenness. So if we are a church of Tav, of goodness, of healing, of beauty, we are taking steps to, first of all, do no harm to anyone who comes within our sphere of influence, and start creating the safe spaces where conversations like this can happen and where healing can begin. So it also emphasizes the importance of self-awareness for leaders, and validation of experiences for people who feel like they walk into a building as broken vessels. And I think that that's really important for leaders to consider.
Right.
The fact that you will have someone this Sunday, every Sunday, walk into your church who either feels broken or is actually broken, often by circumstances beyond their control. And when we're thinking about spiritual abuse and spiritual trauma, um, those people have experienced overwhelming circumstances that have threatened the way that they understand themselves in the world.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a spiritual authority figure manipulating you through guilt, fear, and shame, it changes the way that you see God and the way that you see yourself in light of who God says that you are. So these are very deep identity issues.
Yeah.
And those stories are walking through the doors of your building. And if you're not intentional about it, it's so easy to miss, because you're just, as a church leader, probably excited that they're there.
Right.
And you're not thinking about what they're coming in with. And you're also, what I find as I talk to pastors, it's not because you don't intend to do this, but you just don't know the amount of courage that it takes for that spiritual abuse or spiritual trauma survivor to come back to your building. That is a giant step of faith. It's a leap of faith. Like, it's the equivalent of going to the moon and like that first moon landing where you see that like one giant step for mankind, the whole thing. For a spiritual trauma survivor, going back into church is the same thing.
Yeah.
So Church called Tav, like, it walks leaders through what it looks like to create a space that's going to be safe for that person. And it's not just the one person, because spiritual abuse and trauma is really prevalent. Like, a lot of people have experienced it, but it is also the one person. And Jesus was always going and looking for the one.
Yeah.
So by creating a safe space for the one, you're creating a safe space for the many who will come into your building.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think it kind of highlights a challenge that I feel is, I mean, as a pastor, I represent the structure that caused the abuse, whether I'm the one that caused it or it happened in another church. I mean, we say this a lot at our church. I'll tell people, if you were abused or hurt or traumatized at another church, because I've been in church long enough, I know that I'm going to probably at some point say a phrase or a word that will trigger that for you. And you're going to want to think that I'm that guy. And I'm not saying I'm not, because I'm not perfect, but probably I'm not. And so I recognize, and I'm recognizing it more as I have these conversations. That's why I'm so thankful. Most of our cohort is in the mental health therapy side of it. And I'm loving that, because I recognize how much courage it takes to re-enter a space where you were, you know, hurt in a similar space before. I know you know this because I shared my story at the cohort, but like anxiety attacks and panic attacks, that's part of my history. And so you can, like, the word trigger, we want to make fun of it all the time, but like literally you step into a situation, and if it seems like the last place, you can instantly be back at that place in your mind again. You're feeling all the things in your body. And so I've become much more aware of what you're talking about, and which makes me want to honor people that come back to church. Like, don't come back and pretend to have it all together. I'm just thankful that you're here. My last conversation with Sarah, we talked about that. Like sometimes the win is that you drove your car into the church parking lot. You might not have gotten out of the car and you might have left and not even gone in the
Right.
building, but you did come. And then the next time maybe you get out. And so yeah, yeah, recognizing I want to say small steps, but they're not small steps when you're the one that's trying to grow past the trauma. They're huge steps, and recognizing that is a big deal, I would think. So maybe my follow-up question would be, how does a pastor recognize that without highlighting it in such a way that it suddenly becomes all about that person,
Yeah.
because they might want to just sit at the back and not be noticed
Yeah.
first.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, thinking about our kintsugi metaphor, if we have these broken vessels, then we kind of have to see like what the pieces are.
Mm,
So we have to recognize that like this, like maybe like jumbled group of like clay pieces are actually the part of like one whole thing that needs to be put back together. And I think in terms of, overall church, the way we do church is that we're working together, church staff, church leaders, pastors, to understand the signs and symptoms of trauma.
yeah.
So we're doing some work to get some trauma sensitivity training, and there are all sorts of options out there. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is recommending to churches that they have at least one person on staff trained in something called critical incident stress management, which is one of the resources that I think you'll have in the show notes for people who
Mm-hmm.
are interested. So it basically is a basic early intervention training that helps someone recognize the signs and symptoms of mental health crises and what to do about them. Panic attacks coming into churches after experiencing spiritual abuse or spiritual trauma are not uncommon. And
Mm-hmm.
you're right, we'll have people end up in parking lots. We'll have people who will come to the door and turn around and get back in the car.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have that person on staff who's trained to then train other staff members on what to look for, then we can become as a community better equipped to handle that.
Yeah.
Because, I think about like Hannah and Eli in First Samuel. Hannah was experiencing the trauma of being bullied by the other wife married to her husband, and she came to the synagogue and was crying out to God for help, and she desperately wanted a child.
Mm-hmm.
So she had experienced trauma and she was coming to God, the one place where she wanted to be close to God. And Eli, his first response to her coming and crying out to God was that she must have been drinking. So, and I chuckle when I read that story every time, because some things are old that are still happening,
Yeah.
so if we have someone who walks in the door of a church building, whose hair is a mess, who is disheveled, who might be visibly shaking, who might have gone pale or be sweating, like we might look at that person and think that, maybe they've been drinking at
Right.
9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, when it could be they were abused in a church. It's taken them 3 years to get back into a church building. And the first person they see might be the greeter who's tempted to turn them around.
Mm.
And, that's a general story that I hear some version of, but it also happened to me when I was in college. I went through a very dark period after my parents got divorced and spiraled into standard college behaviors on most state university campuses. Got to a really low place on a Saturday night and wanted to go back to church. Like I just desperately wanted to be in a church building.
Mm-hmm.
So went to the closest church to the campus of the university I attended and looked like that. So I looked like I had been out at a bar all night, because I had been. And the church greeter turned me around at the door and
Oh.
said, I could come back when I pulled myself together.
Mm.
And hearing that in your early 20s takes a lot of work and years to get over. And what I heard in that moment was that my whole broken self was not welcome in that church building.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to think through the experience of a trauma survivor walking into church and care for them uniquely in a way that we make sure we're intentional about our practices on Sunday mornings. Specifically Sunday mornings, because that still is kind of like the high attendance benchmark for most churches. But really, this extends to phone systems for how would someone call your church and receive pastoral care? How would they connect counselors in your community? And a really easy one that almost all churches can immediately implement: know the number 988. It's the National Crisis Hotline. Some people think that it's just for suicide prevention or for connecting with suicidal people, and that's actually not true. So the 988 crisis number is a really easy to implement training mechanism that anyone can use.
Okay.
So if you experience someone walking into your building and you're not sure what to do because you think they might be in crisis, but for whatever reason they can't respond to you in the moment, you can call 988 and ask what your available options are. You can have a 988 crisis person on hand designated every Sunday morning, so a volunteer who's already doing something else. So I know one church that I worked with, they had their lead coffee volunteer is also their 988 person. Okay. So if someone walks in and it looks like that person might be in crisis, then the greeters know to take the potential crisis person to their volunteer who can do some on-the-spot triage to both welcome them with compassion, which is probably high in her gift set. I've met her. She is very empathetic, warm, welcoming. So she has that caring personality and she also has the training to recognize the signs and symptoms someone might be in crisis and then to take action.
Right.
Because we don't want to just recognize that harm may have occurred. We also want to have a pathway that moves that person through a thoughtful, caring process that can help facilitate healing.
Yeah.
And another book resource that I highly recommend is the book When the Church Harms God's People by Diane Langberg. If you're only going to listen to one person other than Paul, whoever is listening to this right now, listen to Diane Langberg. She's been doing this work for a long time. She's a trauma psychologist, I think, or maybe a psychiatrist, but very highly trained, has been doing this work all over the world for decades. And I would definitely consider her one of the foremost experts on spiritual trauma, but not just spiritual trauma healing, which is the critical component. Because thinking again about our Kintsugi project, our art form, we've moved a broken vessel to identifying all the pieces that are part of the vessel to now wanting to get to the final part of the art form, which is applying the gold glue.
Yeah.
So Kintsugi pieces are made more beautiful by the gold glue that's holding all the pieces together, or sometimes silver, but it's made from a precious metal to denote how precious it is to get to the fully final, whole, beautiful art form that has been created out of like the trauma and brokenness. And Diane Langberg's books go through how churches can do that in a really thoughtful and intentional way, every single one of them. But like I said, When the Church Harms God's People is probably my favorite. And thinking about healing, the other things that we can do at churches to help create these spaces where healing can be possible is to offer the ministry of validation. So if you have someone who comes to your church staff or who walks in your door who you eventually find out has church trauma, and also I guess I just also think I need to point out at this point, it's not always going to be obvious when someone walks in that they have a history of church abuse and church trauma. Particularly thinking for senior pastors about your leaders on staff, there is a very significant percentage, in my experience, of pastors who can kind of fake their way through trauma histories fairly effectively for a fairly long time. It still surprises me. Maybe it shouldn't, because I've been doing this for a while, but the number of people I meet who have 15 or 20 years of experience, and then they find their way into some type of a burnout situation, feel like they need to leave their whole careers. And then they have a conversation with me, and we can kind of trace back like how long their history has been going, and realize that they've put on all these masks because they were trying to hide their brokenness.
Yeah.
And books like The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen really speak into this. But also the art form of Kintsugi shows that all those broken places where God has been wanting to work are very beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think about Jesus and how after the resurrection, he could have come back in a fully perfected human body, but he didn't. He came
Mm.
back with all of his scars still visible and physically able for Thomas to touch the spots on his hands and in
Yeah.
his side where he had these what had to be just, significant. You think about the trauma that he endured on the cross, the physical trauma, and what that would have led to, the broken skin. Not he didn't cover any of that up.
Yeah.
And yet we feel like we need to ask trauma survivors to cover up their history, and to not share their stories. The one of the big themes is that we don't want to bring drama into the church. And when I hear that, I chuckle, and I know it's coming from a good place. So no judgment from me at all.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, Christianity is dramatic.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
The
Jesus brought
cross was
drama.
dramatic. Leaving everything to follow Jesus is
Yeah.
dramatic.
Yeah.
So a trauma survivor, whether it's on staff or in your congregation, they can't bring any more drama into the building that's not already there.
Right.
So offering the ministry of validation says, yes, we see you and we see your scars and we see that you have been tremendously hurt in the past. And we don't want you to have to cover that up when you come in the building.
Yeah.
We don't need to self-disclose everything all the time as church leaders, but definitely in your staff, small group, whatever your regular rhythm of meeting looks like, starting to create a culture where it's acceptable to show what your scars are. It's acceptable to show and talk about what you're struggling with. It's acceptable to own the fact that you're struggling with emotional dysregulation, that you have problems with anger, that you need to attend a recovery group. One of my favorite recommendations for pastors is the anonymous group Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of a mouthful, but really it's all about emotional recovery. And it is significant in that it helps pastors start to discern how they've been impacted by dysfunctional systems in their past. And a lot of times, and a lot of people become pastors because they're coming out of dysfunctional environments.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
if we
Yeah.
don't process that, then it can lead to all sorts of trauma situations, both in our own lives and then inflicting trauma onto others.
Yeah. This is such an encouraging conversation, right? I think about at least in our context, church people love to talk about how we're overcomers, but nobody likes to talk about the process of overcoming, right? Like it's a process and we're all in it. So in some areas of my life, I am an overcomer, but in some areas of my life, I'm just getting started. And I think this conversation just breathes grace and space and freedom to like not be perfect yet and recognize that that doesn't diminish the power of God. It actually enhances it. Like Paul said, in my weakness, you're strong.
Yes.
Like when we mask our weakness, we're actually, according to scripture, we're hindering the full power of God from being displayed in our lives. So, and like you said, it's not like we just walk in and go, well, let me tell you all my weaknesses. It's just, no, like let's create spaces where people can just be themselves, be people. And some of the phrases we use at church are like, come as you are,
Yeah.
become more than you were, and go farther than you ever dreamed possible. But it starts by coming as you are. And it's, like
Yes.
you're accepted as family, but then like God shifts our identity. He restores us back to who he intended us to be. And then that fuels our destiny. But you
Yeah,
can't do
absolutely.
any of that if you're going to fake who you are. You have to be authentic. And I appreciate the work that you're doing to not just help people heal, but also challenge pastors and structures in a kind, gracious way. Like, hey, maybe y'all should think about the way that you're presenting to people And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's going to make the church a stronger place. And I appreciate that you do this.
Yeah, thanks. And I hope that that's true. And also, I just encourage anyone listening to this to remember that a little bit of thoughtfulness and intention goes a long way,
For sure.
and that you don't have to do it alone. There are a lot of trained therapists in almost any community who would be thrilled to walk alongside your church. I'm a real big believer in the power of a good referrals list,
Hmm.
and reminding pastors that if you don't have a license to practice counseling, then you're not a licensed counselor. So the limits of your seminary training are small. So 3 to 6 conversations with you as a pastoral care provider should be your limit. And then after that, you're referring trauma survivors to people who can help them
Yeah.
most effectively. So start those referrals lists, update them regularly. And that also goes a long way toward connecting you to your community and the healers in it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such good advice because I know a lot of pastors, I mean, we're in it because we care for people, but then you
Yeah.
can blur the line between that and then being like, I'm going to save you and fix you and all the things. And that's not our job. So I appreciate you just mentioning that everybody should have a referral list and it should absolutely grow as we get to know people in our community. I've so enjoyed this conversation. Is there anything you want to add before we step off? I'll be sure to include all these books in the show notes. You've recommended some great ones. And anything you want to add, how people can get in touch with you, if you want them to get in touch with you, or anything that we're gonna end this and you're gonna be like, man, I wish I'd said that. This is your chance to say that.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm always happy to consult with pastors. I do that all the time, either just for a single conversation, or I'm in the Houston, Texas area. So if you're local, I'm also happy to connect. So my website is ChristaCordova.com. That's CHRISTA Cordova.com. And you can use the contact form there. And I'm also happy to work with folks in your congregations who might need that early intervention support as well.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
thank you, Paul, for hosting this conversation and for all the important work you're doing as pastor in your community, and for being open to considering, how you can facilitate healing communities.
Yeah. Well, thanks for helping us grow, right? I appreciate the way that God's using your profession to shine a light on some really important places where the church needs to change. And I'm so thankful for this conversation. It was a blast.
Thanks, Paul.
Have a great day.
You too.
What a conversation. Like, huge thanks to Christa Cordova for sharing her story and her wisdom, and man, especially just like her heart for healing. Didn't you feel that come through the conversation? If today stirred something in you, take time to pray, to process, maybe reach out to somebody for help. And remember this, healing does not mean hiding our scars. It means letting God turn them, well, into something beautiful. So if this episode has encouraged you, if you found value in it, man, would you share it with a friend, maybe a pastor who needs to hear it? And until next time, can I just encourage you, keep giving God your best and let Him do the rest.